Our next speaker is John Robson. John Robson is a commentator at large with News Talk Radio CFRA 580 in Ottawa. He's a columnist with the National Post. You might have seen his column last week in which he invited us to do lunch right here today. And he's a documentary filmmaker and an invited professor at the University of Ottawa. He holds a BA and an MA in history from the University of Toronto and a PhD in American history from the University of Texas. He's worked in academia, in think tanks and politics, as well as doing print, radio, and television journalism in Canada. He produced and hosted the documentary The Great War Remembered for Sun News in 2014, and the crowd-funded documentary and companion book Magna Carta, Our Shared Legacy of Liberty in 2015. And the crowd-funded documentaries True, Strong and Free, Fixing Canada's Constitution, and also A Right to Arms in 2016. So please welcome John Robson.
Thank you very much. Just got the cyborg business going here. In the modern world, it is not possible to speak to a group of people in a restaurant with at least 5 electronic devices going here. I think we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. There's one in my pocket. We're good. Okay. Thank you all very much for coming out. I'm starting with the question, why am I here? And some of you may remember a dismal performance, the 1992 American vice presidential debate, where James Bond Stockdale stood up, asked that question, and then was unable to answer it. And it was a very sad moment. I was actually a great admirer of Admiral Stockdale, but if you're going to ask that question, you need to be able to come up with some kind of answer. And my answer actually turns on the single word, first. The reason I ask what I'm doing here, in the first place, this is a bit of an odd event, as you all know, because shelters are for women. And secondly, because it is a topic a little outside my usual range. I do public policy, I do culture, and if you've read my column, you know I'm inclined toward polemics. When in doubt, find something idiotic and criticize it. As a columnist, deadlines come up often, so you're scanning the paper for some enormous fatuity. And I'm not here primarily to do that sort of thing today, despite the fact that some of my remarks have already been a bit pointed. I'm here, and I'm proud to be on the board of the Ottawa branch of the Canadian Centre for Men and Families because of the crying need for this facility. As Cafe says, next slide, and I mentioned in my National Post column, this is Ottawa's first multi-service hub for the health and well-being of boys, men, fathers, and families. And it's that word first that has me here. How can it be the first? How can it be that people have not noticed that there are a fair number of men in Ottawa? I mean, you see them on the street quite often. And how can people not realize that there are problems in men's lives that require addressing in an urgent way? I might say it's odd to have me associated with a venture like this. I'm not the world's most touchy-feely person. And some of my views on gender are, in fact, more conservative than those, I think, of many of the people in Cafe, as it actually exists, not perhaps as it exists in the minds of its more excitable critics. But I am a conservative in all sorts of ways, including on a lot of social issues. But I'm here because it astounds me that there should be no multi-service hub for the health and well-being of boys, men, fathers, and families in Ottawa, and yet the kind of people you would expect to be creating this thing are not lining up to create it. There shouldn't be room for me to get involved in this because there are so many people out there, genuinely caring people. There are so many resources out there to deal with social problems that you would think that my presence here would be superfluous. And the reason I'm here is that it just isn't. It happens that it's not. It turns out that I am needed, and so I'm here. You know, we live, to some degree, it's been said, in the age of therapeutic man. More than a century after Freud, counseling, getting in touch with our feelings, opening up. This is the model of how human beings are supposed to be. And we also live in an era where feminism is intellectually dominant. It enjoys a very strong position, not just in academia, but in culture generally. If you look at movies, what is the model of love? Unconditional love. Was it Finding Dory? I was watching this recently. I've been reading David Shackleton's book, and so I was very much struck by the emphasis on the kind of love that does not make demands or draw boundaries. The whole thing is a very feminine, female, and feminist portrayal. But as a result of this, men are supposed to open up. They're supposed to reveal their feelings. We're not looking for James Bond anymore. We're not looking for Gary Cooper and High Noon. We are looking for men who are in touch with their softer side, who when they have a problem, they're meant to go and find help. They're meant to talk about it. They're meant to admit to feelings of inadequacy. They're meant to do all this stuff, and yet there isn't a place for them to go and do it. And that, it seems to me, just doesn't make sense. That's very odd. That seems to me to be very much at odds with the culture as it presents itself. That there is a contradiction here between what people say they believe and at least this aspect of things. In my National Post column, I cited some statistics from Café's literature about the fact, for instance, that nearly a quarter of men in Canada have considered or attempted suicide, and I presume this means not just it once did occur to me that it would be possible to end my life, but that they've seriously weighed the possibility. They've thought about this as an option that might actually be the right one for them. And that men account for 3/4 of all completed suicides. Men are equally likely to report being a victim of spousal abuse, but 4 times less likely to have access to services such as a crisis center or support group. And shelters for male victims of violence do not exist in Canada. And I thought, well, this is very, very odd. And I've written about Café before, and you certainly get some sympathetic responses. You get some enthusiasm. And this being the age of the internet, you get some extremely unpleasant comments online, and you get them from both sides. You know what this is like. You could put up anything. You could put up a knitting pattern online, and before you know it, someone will be engaging in abuse, and then you'd be compared to Hitler. So it happens all over the place. But there was some really serious and surprised kind of, where are you getting these numbers from? How can you say this stuff? And I look at this and I think, can this be real? Does anybody really deny that men are more likely to go to jail than women? Next slide. These are StatsCan numbers. Probably you can't see them at all, but if you could, you'd realize that they are showing female and Aboriginal. And then there's other, there's something else. There's a residual category. So here we have female 11%. That's in Newfoundland and Labrador. So something else is going to be 89%, whatever that is, whoever those people are. And it's interesting, custody 11, community 21, total 16. So the females are more likely to get community supervision, and whoever these other people are, they're more likely to actually get put behind bars. And you go on down the line, and these sort of numbers are present everywhere, but they don't have a column for men. It just is not interesting that there's this residual category of men who are going to jail, and I think that's kind of odd. And again, we know men are more likely to go to jail and less likely to go to university. Undergraduate enrollment now is more than half female. And I'm not objecting to women going to university. My mother was one of the very first professors in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. In fact, she told me late at her wake, I heard the story. I never knew the story about her. But she went in to be interviewed. This was in the early 1960s. And the department chairman, after interviewing me, said, well, that was an excellent interview, but we don't hire women. To which my mother responded, you're going to hire this one. And they did. And And 100 years after the first admission of women to the university, to Victoria College, my mother gave my sister her degree in the ceremony. So again, I'm not at this moment engaged in any kind of complaint about the fact that university education has been opened up to women, that it seems to be working for them and that they're doing very well. But what about the phenomenon, why are fewer and fewer boys completing high school and pursuing higher education? Isn't this something that ought to attract our attention as well, without wishing to displace women from university? Does anybody dispute that men suffer far more workplace fatalities than women? Or they commit suicide more often? Again, next slide. This is at the bottom of that chart in Statistics Canada. It says women accounted for 15% of overall, a higher proportion of community, the small share of admission to remand in sentence custody. That's it. It's all a discussion of women. And then the slide after that. I'm sorry, these are not the greatest slides, but again, here are the suicide statistics, and this is suicide rates for men, and you're looking at numbers around 17 per 100,000. It's fairly consistent all ages and the age patterns. Then we have the statistics for women, and you see that these numbers are less than a third. And so the logical thing to do here surely would be to concentrate resources, at least for suicide prevention, in the most vulnerable population, and that's men. This stuff ought to be the subject of inquiries. There ought to be money being spent on this. There should be studies. There should be parliamentary committees on it. And yet, it doesn't happen. It's like, we had this big kerfuffle over whether there was going to be a commission investigating murdered and missing Aboriginal women. And this, again, fell into the typical polemical kind of rat hole, and it was going to be a chance to embarrass the Conservatives if they didn't do it or something. And of course, we're dealing with tragic people being murdered, probably many times in horrible ways, and the law just not coming to grips with it. But of course, there are a lot more murdered Aboriginal men. And many of them, too, are leading troubled lives that end horribly. Why isn't there a national commission on that? Do they not matter? At least the correctional statistics. There is some attention to the overrepresentation of Aboriginals in prisons and penitentiaries and so on. But this sort of thing it's at odds, as I said before, with the society's image of itself. Next slide here. This is about education. StatsCan is having a look at what's going on and saying women accounted for 56.3% of total enrollments, over half the enrollments in most fields of study, with the exceptions. So it lists the places they don't enroll. They don't enroll in transportation services. I don't know why not, but there's probably a program to get women interested in doing that. They're underrepresented in computer and information sciences, and of course there's a lot of effort put into getting girls in high school interested in science and interested in computers so that they can be a majority in this field as well. And then at the bottom it says, it does actually list the top field of study for men, which is architecture, engineering, and related, which is past business management and public administration. So men are there as an afterthought. But if 56% of undergraduate enrollments were men, there would be a huge effort to get the female number up to 50%. And I don't think everybody should go to university. I come from a family where everybody did go to university. Have a relative who's only got an MA. It's sort of the dark black sheep of the family. These things happen, but actually, some of you know, he runs one of Canada's top think tanks, so I think he did okay despite not getting the PhD. And again, when I talk about all this, I don't want to suggest in any way that women's issues are not important, including the issue of protecting women from violence, a lot of which comes from intimate partners, most of whom, vast majority of whom, are men. Of course it matters. Of course it is right that there are shelters. Of course it is right that there is counseling. Well, and one of the ways in which I'm a fairly conservative person is that I'm pretty strong on law and order, and I'm very strong on protecting people from violence and punishing people who perpetrate violence. So I'm not saying it's wrong that there are women's shelters. I'm not saying that problem has been solved or is trivial or anything like that. But I'm saying that for women there is a refuge. And for men, essentially, there is not. Because again, the situation in Ottawa, if a man is fleeing domestic abuse, he can go to a homeless shelter. That is the one thing he can do. But he can't take his children with him. So he's got to leave the kids with the person he's fleeing from, or else stay. That's not just unbalanced. That's unhinged. I don't see how this can be happening. Now, when I was preparing these remarks, I happened to get a press release. One of the interesting things about being in my business is that you get all kinds of press releases. And some people must understand that columnists are prowling around looking for something to ridicule. They probably shouldn't tell us what they're doing because we're liable to take an uncharitable view of it with a deadline 3 hours away. This one, however, I saved for the talk. Next slide. And it starts off, see it, name it, change it, campaign launched. And there are, you see these bulletin boards and stuff, billboards. And it starts off, have you ever heard a mean joke, walked by a couple fighting and feel one is scared, or heard people you care about hurting one another and you haven't known what to do? A new campaign aims to change that. Members of Beyond the Forums, a working group of individuals from Lanark, Lennox, and Addington, Leeds, and Granville, have come together in response to increased violence and murders in rural Eastern Ontario and have launched this campaign. And then it goes on about the importance of stopping domestic violence. And I'm reading this and thinking, yeah, okay, that's obviously a very worthwhile cause. There aren't a lot of things in this world worse than domestic violence. I was feeling encouraged. Then I came to the 7th paragraph. Next slide. And you know what it's going to say. Lanark County Interval House alone fields more than 2,000 crisis calls annually and offers direct support to more than 450 women and children. Ontario provincial police statistics continue to show violence against women is a prominent issue. They don't argue that this is the core of the problem, men hitting women. They take it for granted. And then they just move on to talk about how bad violence is. The complaint that feminists used to have about women being invisible. The male victims are invisible. You're in a situation, I don't know what's happened to the protesters. My first cafe event, there were protesters. I don't know, you can't even get protested. That's kind of a sad thing. But, because I was at the opening of the Institute for Marriage and Family Canada years ago, and we had protesters, some of whom thought that IMFC must be a branch of the IMF, and they were there against international banking. It was like, I don't care, we'll take it. Protest us, make us feel that we matter. But you're in a situation where the problem isn't that people argue with you when you try and make these points. The problem is getting people to believe you said what they just think they heard you say. And that's why I'm here. Because, as I said in the column, even if men hit more often and harder, even if there should always be more shelters for women and children, is it fair or kind to have none for men? And let's not leave out, because CAFE is an inclusive organization. What about a man whose partner is male and is suffering domestic abuse? Where is there concern for his issues? Where is there a place that he can go? More and more gay couples have children these days. Where is a place he can take his children? It's just very odd. And as I said, there's a contradiction here between the ideology that society puts forward, the dominant ideology, and the actual behavior and the institutional setting. And being a polemicist by nature, I am tempted to get into this question of an ideology that says one thing and then produces a different kind of behavior. But CAFE is not a polemical group. Dave Shackleton is not a man spoiling for a fight. And so I'm not going to talk about that here today. There's a time and a place for that sort of thing, and there's a time and a place for a very different approach, which is to think about the positive, the problem solving, the stuff that Justin was talking about. To think about how do we enlist more people who don't just claim to be concerned about this kind of thing, but really are concerned about it in the cause of providing a refuge for men, a place for men to go and talk. This kind of success that's happened in Toronto, getting more of the social service agencies involved, taking CAFE seriously, believing it has something to say that can help them in their work, including, I was delighted to hear, that the Toronto Police. Because, again, this is not a polemical or ideological group in the pejorative sense that that word is sometimes used. Again, in the column I quoted that CAFE welcomes people of every sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, that it will celebrate diversity among men and masculinities, welcoming people of every kind of sexual as well as ethnic and religious inclination. And as I said in the column, trust me on this, folks, anyone who distinguishes sexual orientation from gender expression and speaks of masculinities is not part of the vast right-wing conspiracy. You know, in my day job, it could be argued that I am part of the vast right-wing conspiracy. Sometimes I wish we were vaster. We sometimes seem to be badly outnumbered. But CAFE is not like that. CAFE is looking for engagement with social service, health-related, women's, and LGBT groups. And so part of the question is, are those groups in turn serious about seeking engagement with CAFE? And in Toronto, increasingly, yes. I look forward to the day when we can say in Ottawa that the same thing is true. When we can say that, having gotten over their initial surprise, and maybe that will be less painful because they have the example of Toronto, that they will say, yeah, there is a problem here. There is something that needs to be done. There are people who are in crisis now. People whose problems won't wait while we argue out questions like, what is the place of men in modern society? Is the predominant problem that men have today that they're still too attached to traditional role models, or is the problem that they have become entirely detached from them? What is the correct position of feminism with respect to, people call CAFE sometimes a men's rights activist group. CAFE expressly says it's not one, but you know, you can't always control what people say about you. There are all kinds of important debates to be had about that, but there are also people who need a place to go now. People who have a problem they feel that they cannot deal with. People whose life is breaking down around them. People who have gotten separated or divorced and find they're being cut out of their children's lives. Men who are contemplating suicide. They feel worthless because they can't find work. They can't provide as they think they should be able to. Or they're suffering domestic abuse. Obviously, there is a lot wrong with men in Canada today. The statistics, I think, are very, very hard to overlook once you have looked at them. And, you know, some of us believe that there's a lot wrong with human beings and will be till history ends. We call it original sin. But this is not a revival meeting. Not everybody here is a Christian or religious. Not everybody believes in original sin. But the people here who don't can tell you the statistics the same as I can about incarceration, about dropout rates, about the tendency of courts, even if a separation is amicable, to award custody to the woman. All these kinds of things that make men's lives very difficult and make them difficult right now, today, as we are gathered here inside this room, safe, warm, enjoying an excellent meal and discussing what to do next and bidding on artwork and other such things. There are people out there who are in terrible trouble and who need a place to turn and can't wait. And that's why I'm here. Because families are important, holding families together. It's important for the children. Men are important to their children. That idea that, oh, you know, the father is dispensable. If he's not actively harmful, he's certainly not very necessary. That is a very dangerous idea, and yet we live in a world in which governments are taking mother and father off the forms. There's a British health authority that said, please do not use the term expectant mother, because this will be upsetting to transgender individuals who are expecting children. And there wasn't any real attempt to say how many of these people are there versus how many women actually are excited at being expectant mothers. But you take mother and father off the form, you say that whatever these men are who seem to be other in the prison statistic, it's not important to have them around. And of course, that is a thing that leaves a lot of men feeling worthless. And we need a place at least where they can go and talk about that. Say, I'm confused. I don't understand how this is meant to work. We need a place for the father who says, I want to stay involved in my children's life. And at least to know they're not alone, to hear the stories that other men have had, to hear about the feelings that other men have had, and to know that what they're going through makes some kind of sense, even if it's not fair. To be told what to do and what not to do. How not to do the sort of things that will make it impossible to see your children. All these kinds of things are so important. So where are the government organizations? Where are the major feminist groups? Where are all the people who are devoted to doing good in this world in a positive way? Where are the social justice warriors? Where are the people who profess their compassion at every opportunity when it comes to this crisis that is so clear from the statistics? Well, I don't know where they are. I hope one day they'll be here. But in the meantime, we are here. even people like me who you might not expect to be here, who might not be the most obvious choice for this kind of thing. Last slide. I'm here because I know there are men and boys in trouble who can't wait. And this group is going to do something for them that they desperately need, and it's going to do it soon, and it's going to make a big difference in Ottawa. And that's the same reason that you're here. I thank you all for being here, because this work is so important, and we are going to make it succeed.